I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Brent Ziarnick, Associate Professor at the Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Air Force Base. Brent's past roles include work with the New Mexico Spaceport Authority and Air Force Reserve, with a focus on management and leadership for space assets. Brent is the author of 3 books, including Developing National Space Power, To Rule the Skies, and 21st Century Power, which was awarded Best Air Power History Book of 2021 by the Air Force Historical Society. Brent has also been published in Wired, Politico, The Hill, and many other popular media venues. He has a PhD in military strategy from Air University, a PhD in economic development from New Mexico State University, a master's in military strategy from the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, a master's in military operational art and science from the USAF Air Command and Staff College, an ME from the University of Colorado, and a bachelor's in space operations from the U.S. Air Force Academy. So, Brent, welcome. It is a pleasure and honor to have you with me today, sir.
Hey, thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me back. It's always good to talk to you. And that sounds like a lot
Absolutely.
of schooling. Holy mackerel.
It does. It does. You are absolutely a subject matter expert. Before anything else, I want to start out by thanking you for your career of service. It matters. It makes a difference in keeping us safe, and it's important that we recognize the contributions of service members like yourself. So thank you, sir. So
Well, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
today, we're going to dig in today. We're discussing themes from your book on General Thomas Power. We're going to be talking about the Cold War, nuclear weapons, and the space race, and hopefully painting a picture of what we call the atomic age. So there's a lot to unpack here, but let me start out with your book, To Rule the Skies, General Thomas S. Power and the Rise of Strategic Air Command in the Cold War. What inspired you to write the book, and why focus on General Thomas Power?
Well, actually, it was very oblique how that came about. I was studying after I was done with my doctorate at New Mexico State. I was working as an officer at the National Security Space Institute in Colorado for the Air Force Space Command, and was trying to look into the old Air Force space program in the 50s and 60s. And one article that I was reading from an Air University professor that was an expert in doctrine, Major General I.B. Hawley, uh, asked a question in one of his papers. How would space and military space have been different had Strategic Air Command gotten the space mission, an operational command, rather than Air Research and Development Command,
Mm.
an acquisitions command uh, in the 1960s? And I thought back to a book that I had read a few years earlier by George Dyson called Project Orion. And it was like, I know exactly how to answer that question because General Thomas Power was a huge fan of Orion. And I started to read into that nexus. And in my research on Orion, I just became more and more fascinated with Tommy Power, who at the Air Force Academy, we were, not to get too crude, were told that he was just a dumber, more violent version of Curtis LeMay.
Mm.
And I just accepted that until I read into it and found out he was just a fascinating character.
Well, there are wheels within wheels here, and we did connect over George Dyson's book Orion, Project Orion. I'm actually working on doing an interview with him about that because his father, Freeman Dyson, was one of the key participants in that project. And so one of the things that I had mentioned to him was your work in historical research, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I know Brent. Yeah, Brent and I've worked together in the past." I was just blown away. I was like, "Oh my God, small world."
Oh yeah,
So,
he was nice enough to help me out when I was a young captain in I guess 2000, gosh, 14, 2015 when I first started out. He was super helpful. Nice guy.
oh
I'm
yeah,
glad you're
yeah.
working with him.
And a brilliant researcher as well. I'm halfway through the book Project Orion, and there is so much. And your books are amazing also. So again, it's doing the homework, doing the backstory of it, getting all the facts together and laying that out. And so as I was going through and doing all of these, again, wheels within wheels of research, right? This interested me in Thomas Power. And so you and I were originally going to talk about Orion. I still have notes on the interview sheet for it. But, the more that I dug into this, I was like, you know what? There is a deeper story here. So let me try and paint a picture for the audience because I think that this post World War II Cold War era is something that it's easy to forget, right? And it kind of fades out from memory over time. But 70 to 85 million people died in World War II, including 407,000 U.S. service members. The German Holocaust and the Japanese Kamikazes were recent history for the 1950s era Cold Warriors, right? I mean, the Bataan Death March, things like that. The Nuremberg trials were still going on in the late 40s. All of this was their present, not their past. Um, the Cold War itself only started a year and a half after the end of World War II. The Berlin airlift was in 1948, and then the Russian bomb was in 1949. So Strategic Air Command was established back in 46 before the Air Force, a year before the Air Force was founded in 47. So you've got basically SAC and then the Air Force coming into this climate of fear, chaos, and global conflict, right? And this, again, this wasn't ancient history for them. This was their present. These were World War II veterans who had seen horrible, terrifying things. And now they were tasked with protecting the United States from it.
Absolutely. It's in a lot of ways, World War II just went straight into the Cold War, and the first warriors in the Cold War had just finished, the world's largest and most destructive conflict. So there wasn't really any time of peace in between. And a lot of people just brought their very recent experience into policy making and defense, preparations into the Cold War right away. In the Air Force, it was especially interesting because many general officers in the Air Force were extraordinarily young. Uh, LeMay flew early on in the war. Uh, Power was in his late 30s. I don't think he was even 40 when he flew the first firebomb mission that he and LeMay put together over Tokyo. He was still probably 39, which is, 7 years younger than I am. And he was already a one-star general. In the Cold War, he would earn, three extra stars over a 20 years as a general officer, almost 20 years as a general officer in the Air Force. And the people that fought, literally fought in World War II, managed defense up until in Power's, example, up until 1965. And we're well
Mm.
into the Cold War at that time. So in many ways, it was just business as usual. The Cold War, only you weren't getting shot at
Yeah.
always.
Y- Yeah. Well, let me go into a little bit of history on General Thomas Sarsfield Power, born in 1905, passed in 1970. He was an Air Force officer who served as Commander in Chief of the Strategic Air Command from 57 to 1964. He actually also flew for 30 years, served in World War II, worked directly with General Curtis LeMay, and when LeMay was named Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force in 1957, Power became Commander in Chief of Strategic Air Command and was promoted to a four-star rank. So that's the four stars right there. He took it over and he actually made a lot of big changes there, right?
He did. As a matter of fact, I would say this might be heretical, but power is as important to Strategic Air Command as LeMay in anything but not being the first one. Because LeMay and Power first worked together in 20th Air Force at the end of World War II with the strategic bombing campaigns over Japan, and essentially never stopped working together after that. Um, they were both flying heavy bombers, and when Curtis LeMay got Strategic Air Command um, early on, he brought Power off from a diplomatic assignment to be his deputy for many, many years. And Power was deputy of Strategic Air Command and then commander of Strategic Air Command with only one very small, almost 3 year detour with Power being in command of Air Research and Development Command, where he learned an awful lot about space and had a huge space impact in the engineering acquisitions research side before going back into the operational service at SAC.
Yeah. Well, so I want to get into their combat missions before I come back to some of the changes that he made. And there's actually kind of a larger theme here that I think is really important to at least explore, and maybe that'll help our understanding. But General Power first saw combat flying B-24 missions with the 304th Bomb Wing in North Africa in Italy. Curtis LeMay saw significant combat during World War as well, leading the 305th Bombardment Group and later the 3rd Bombardment Division in the European theater. Both of these generals, in fact, the list goes on there. I'll stop there and move on to the rest of this. As you mentioned, they orchestrated firebombing raids on Japan. They were pivotal figures. Curtis LeMay is one of those outstanding Air Force historical figures, right? But the thing that struck me about this, as I was reading through their background, I was thinking both of these generals, as well as most of our military leaders, saw real combat in World War II, right? It was kill or be killed. They saw horrors, I mean, immorality beyond compare, and one of the things that I had wondered was if the military leaders in the 50s and 60s weren't struggling in silence with PTSD as well as maybe traumatic brain injuries from earlier service. That's something that, at the time, right, they called it battle fatigue, and they had shell shock was World War One, right? But they didn't have the diagnostic and treatment that they have today for that. And I think it was also considered weak to admit that they were struggling with these things. So, one of the things that I've wondered is if some of the attitudes, especially in the 50s, not only came from what they saw, but also from, again, PTSD and TBI that may have gone undiagnosed for many of these fellows.
That's certainly possible. I'm not sure if I've read any research about that, although that would be fairly fascinating. From my research with Power, they were definitely aware of these things, and uh, in at least one interview that I saw or that I read from him, they weren't quite as macho and bravado about it as you might think. During one interview, uh, General Power was asked by an interviewer about, the pressures of flying in bombers, especially where there were very high casualty rates. You never really got to see your enemy that much. Your plane could go down at any time and was very stressful. But Power mentioned, I remember quite clearly, he was saying, we all flew, and every now and then there would be people that would, I believe his term was crack,
Yeah.
not in a pejorative way, but just that's how he was able to explain it. And he stressed to the interviewer that you could never tell which uh, air crew would do it, what leaders would do it, because some were acting very macho, very, a pilot's pilot up until their last mission, and then they would just fall apart and couldn't operate anymore. And others that you would think, oh, this guy's not going to last, 20 minutes, would last throughout the entire war and be very dependable. And he said that you just couldn't tell, and it could happen to anybody. So we like to think, or some of us may think, that a lot of people were very, didn't want to talk about it, or, weren't interested, or this will never happen to me, having that macho attitude. But there seems pretty clear that a lot of people realized that this was happening and didn't really hold any blame, because there were people that they flew dozens of missions with just would stop one day, and that doesn't diminish their service. That just means they're no longer mission
Yeah.
capable. And could it
Well,
have happened to Power or LeMay? Absolutely. But I guess it didn't.
the reason that I wanted to mention that, and kind of the reason that I built up this backstory in terms of the horrors of war so much, is when I was reading about Power as well as LeMay, because they worked very closely together. One of the things that becomes incredibly apparent is both of these service members were war hawks. And so I have a couple of quotes. I want to read these just to showcase kind of where their minds were at. But a couple of LeMay's more memorable quotes are, if you kill enough of them, they stop fighting. And he also said, I think there are many occasions when it would be most efficient to use nuclear weapons. And in fact, his complaint was what he called negative propaganda against nukes. Otherwise, he would have probably gone ahead and used them. He said something to that effect. Thomas Power has memorable quotes. One of the big ones was, restraint? Why are you so concerned with saving their lives? The whole idea is to kill the bastards. At the end of the war, if there are 2 Americans and 1 Russian left alive, we win. Now, in that case, and I don't have the note written down here, he was arguing with a PhD from the Rand Corporation who was talking about alternative strategy. And in the quote, when I was reading it, the PhD was so flustered by that, he said, well, you'd better hope that after the war, you've got a man and a woman left then, and walked away. So these were both war hawks. And the reason that I mention that is, again, I think that some of that, maybe a lot of that, comes out of their background. I think it's also related to some other things I want to get into later. And it also goes to one of Power's achievements. He was the architect of the Operation Chrome Dome Airborne Alert Program at Strategic Air Command. And so the idea there was to ensure that a proportion of nuclear-armed strategic bombers were always in the air to survive a first strike. And when I was reading about that, I was like, this strategy is basically, hey, we're not taking chances, right?
Oh, yeah. Uh, I get into it a little bit in the book, based on my reading of Power, because that's the first thing that you confront, is that he has a lot of wild quotes, shall we say. And a lot of people, including the Soviet Union and other Cold War historians later, tended to use that as an indictment against Power. And I believed it until I started reading what he, said, and what he did and what he wrote. In my opinion, of some of those more uh, colorful quotes, I believe is more his sarcastic attitude and his
Mm.
dismissive attitude against uh, civilian intellectuals that sort of pestered him throughout the Cold War. Uh, George Kistakowski was one that he was particularly annoyed with. Uh, if you're in the military at all, you'll start to notice that at least some people have a very fatalistic or dark sense of humor. That's how you know,
Yeah.
uh, you know, uh, what do you call it? I would say, that's just how you can handle things. That's how you cope,
Well,
I guess.
I've read about the British soldiers. I don't remember what campaign this was, but they would shake the hands of dead people on the ground, right? And that was an example of black humor in the British, the British military. So yeah,
It
it gets
it most
dark.
certainly happens, and I also think it was sort of and he said this a lot to let people know that considered themselves experts because they went to school while he was flying over Tokyo, that he didn't particularly think very highly of them either. So I would caution people that would think that, oh my God, I can't believe someone said that. Power was actually very theatrical as a commander, and he was playing to a crowd. He, I do not think that he was really hoping to kill every single Russian, and would have done it as long as there were two people left in the United States. That's just not what military leaders do.
Yeah. Although, and again, I didn't write this down. I wasn't going to mention this. Curtis LeMay did describe him as a sadist and said, I worry about him sometimes.
That was sort of taken out of context by a guy named McKinley Cantor, I believe his name was, and he said, "So was Power a sadist general?" And he was like, "Sure, he was, but he was, he had to do his job." So I think that was a little misleading too. That being the
Okay.
case, there were people that thought he might have played the part a little bit too well. There's absolutely the case. General David Wade, I believe, was one of them that was really worried about Power.
Well, again, I love it that you're filling in the blanks here. I mean, I can go through and skim, which I did. I spent about 4 hours doing research, but that can't compare to the depth of understanding that you have, right? Especially when you're talking about things like sarcasm, things that can often be, misquoted, misportrayed, right? Like you just mentioned, a reporter misportraying LeMay's quote. So things like that. Again, this is the nuance that it's easy to miss, and that's why it's really wonderful to be able to talk about these things.
Oh yeah, and it was fun to write about him too because in a lot of ways you're like, I don't know if that's really the right interpretation, and then you get into reading and doing some more, and you're like, oh, I get it now. And then I have my narrative. Of course, other people would have their narrative, and who knows what's really true. We just try to be as objective as possible and report.
Yeah.
Although it seems pretty clear in my book that, I ended up thinking that General Power was misunderstood in a pretty good general. So, at least I put my biases out there.
Well, and again, these were war hawks, and if anyone has seen that famous movie, Doctor Strangelove, right?
Oh yeah.
That would be representative of that time. The general there was an exaggerated portrayal of some of the attitudes, and
Yep.
so again, when I was doing research for this, I was thinking of this period of time, which was this mixture of strange extremes. You had 16 million Americans serve in World War II. Around a million of those saw combat. Roughly 400,000 Americans died, right? The ones who came home left the military, got civilian jobs, got married, bought houses, and started having babies. In fact, the baby boom, if I remember correctly, was something like 3.1 children per woman compared to, I believe, 1.6 today. So lots and lots of families and children. And one of the things that came into my mind was you've got military leaders like LeMay and Power with these terrifying memories of global conflict, the ongoing threat of nuclear Armageddon, and now they've lost a good part of their forces and they've got a country full of families and babies to protect. So if I had been in that position, I was thinking about this last night. I thought, I probably would take a hard line on defense also.
Well, it's yeah. I mean, you can look at it a couple of different ways. Were they people that, hey, we fought a war and we know what it takes to keep people safe? Or did they go overboard? Possibly. Uh, did they talk big to scare the Russians? They tried. Uh, but then these are the same people that a lot of people might think they're monsters. But one thing that they did at SAC a lot is work on old cars after, the shift was over, LeMay and Power both. So they were human beings too. Um, but then again, everyone can consider them war hawks quite a bit. But Strategic Air Command never killed anyone in anger and never dropped a bomb in anger until after LeMay had left in Vietnam, and especially for their nuclear mission. So in nuclear deterrence, especially in the SAC days, peace was their profession. It wasn't a joke. They meant it. Although it probably had, they appreciated the irony, no doubt. But if you talk big and you act like a psychopath, the bad guy doesn't attack you out of fear. At least that's what they thought.
Okay. So, and you've said this a couple of times. Let me put a pin in this then. There is sarcasm, there is talking big to intimidate potential enemies and rivals, and that is not necessarily the God's honest truth of what they felt themselves, right? What we say is not always what we believe. And it sounds like, from what you're telling me, they were talking big intentionally to achieve a desired effect.
That's how I would interpret it. Although I would caveat that with if the balloon went up, would they have attacked the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons? Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let me transition just a little bit into the atomic age, a little bit less of a focus on LeMay power for a bit. So I used Wikipedia for this because Wikipedia suggests that everything post World War II is quote unquote the atomic age. And I was like, you know what? That doesn't really feel right. The phrase itself gained popularity as a feeling of nuclear optimism in the 1950s. And so when I read that, I thought that's a little more appropriate, right? Tail fins and the bomb, and that was what George Dyson was writing about in the Project Orion book. The 1960s saw nuclear energy as a potential solution to energy needs. And then in the 70s, we started to see concerns about nuclear safety and waste disposal, culminating in the 1979 Three Mile Island accident, which then increased public anxiety and kind of turned the tide against nuclear energy. So I'm looking at the atomic age as the 50s, and it was really characterized by optimism and we're going to use nuclear power for everything. Um, Project Orion, as we mentioned, there was Project Rover, and the Nerva engine was a nuclear fission engine. Ford was actually getting into the act. They wanted to build a nuclear automobile, if I remember correctly. So it was nuclear everything, right? And I guess at the time, we didn't have the understanding of fallout and pollution that we did today. So,
Yeah. It was interesting when I looked into it because I had my biases, same as anyone growing up in the 80s and 90s of wow, why were they so, you know, interested in nuclear weapons and nuclear energy and stuff like that? But really in the 50s, people thought, they no kidding thought that it wouldn't be cheap electricity. Nuclear power would provide free electricity, so abundant that it wouldn't even have to be metered. And when you have the ability to have an unlimited supply of electricity or energy, you can start to dream about anything that you're interested in. And then combine that with, I'll bring power into it again. Here was a man that was born just a little bit after the first flight, but when he started his Air Force career in the 20s, was flying very rickety bombers that were made of canvas and had most of the time you flew with the windows open, you know, and ended his career, only 40 years with Mach 2 bombers and people telling him that, hey, nuclear power will allow us to go to another star. And if you've seen so much from going from, an airplane that could go a couple hundred miles an hour to a couple, to two, three, four, five, six, seven, 8 times that, why wouldn't you think that, you know, we could do whatever we wanted as long as we put our mind to it? So there was an age of wonders in a lot of ways. Now, did they have a negative, effect? Yeah.
yeah.
But they had a positive effect too. And if you were positive enough, you could see a very optimistic future. And some did, and then others didn't. And then others counted the cost. And, uh, we're 70, 75 years away from the beginning of that atomic age. Not everything panned out.
Well, let me jump around in my notes a little bit because since we're talking about nuclear development, one of the things that I think, again, it's almost like the forgotten history of this area. And I've read articles talking about that, saying that the cultural knowledge, the scientific knowledge of that nuclear era is starting to, again, it's starting to fade, right? We still have it, but it's written down. It's not in people's minds. And the people who knew it and developed it, are passing rapidly. And so in terms of what was developed at the time, you had, I mean, obviously you had the bomb in World War II, then you had the H bomb. Everybody knows about the development of those things. But what they don't realize was at that same time, you had massive development of things like nuclear energy supplies, the nuclear submarine, right? I think the Nautilus was the first one. But you had nuclear reactors on subs, which we use to this day, nuclear reactors on aircraft carriers, which we use currently. You also start to have the development of nuclear RTGs. We use those in space, we use them in satellites. So we have nuclear power plants that are, off Earth right now, powering probes, which is really amazing. You also had bigger, more grandiose visions. Project Orion, where they literally wanted to drop a bunch of small nukes below and basically an enormous garbage pail lid and just watch the thing skyrocket into space. You had nuclear thermal fission, right? That was Project Rover and Nerva. Many proposed variations on those over the years. And then you also had lots of what are called tactical nuclear weapons. So, one of them in George Dyson's book, I was surprised to read. He said they got an actual nuclear bomb down to a 6 pound device. Apparently, you could hold this in your hand. Now, it wasn't super powerful, but it's still a nuclear bomb. I was like, that's amazing, terrifying, but amazing. Another one that I've followed for a while was the Davy Crockett. That was a nuclear RPG, right? They wanted to fill the Fulda Gap full of radiation with that. That was about 100 pounds. Then you had basically backpack nukes, the XM 129, 159, and B 54. And I saw a photo of a Navy SEAL jumping out of a plane with one of those strapped to his legs. It was dangling underneath him as he parachuted to the ground. I believe those weighed around 60 pounds. So you had lots of development of a variety of nuclear devices. And then the thing that I'm leaving out is atomic munitions as well. Missile warheads, those are tactical nukes. And you actually had like Atomic Annie, the cannon. So they were putting nuclear, it was nuclear everything for the military at that time, right?
Well, yeah, the new look of Eisenhower administration really looked to try to use the high technology of nuclear weapons to alleviate the need to put millions upon millions of men in uniform with conventional weapons and stuff like that. And that time seems so far away, but my one of my instructors at the School for Advanced Air and Space Studies, a great man named Hal Winton, um, started at his Army career as a Davy Crockett, artilleryman. And he was saying, oh, yeah, we would have to look every time we would fire where the prevailing winds were and all that stuff before we could fire. And we all knew that if we fired this thing, we were done. So, so he
Yeah.
decided to do something safe, like go special forces in Vietnam later on. But yeah, there was a lot of those things. In Orion, part of the reason Orion didn't quite go as far as they were hoping is because it really drove the miniaturization. That program would drive the miniaturization of very heavy fission weapons for their pellets, for their propulsive devices. And if you can get a really small but high yield nuclear weapon that's really small, only a couple of feet, maybe even a couple of inches that are in diameter, uh, that makes a great spacecraft propulsion pellet. You can also put it in a backpack and take out a city.
Yeah.
And that was a worry.
And I guess one of the things that, again, they weren't looking at closely enough was this idea of fallout, right? Because as I started reading through Orion, because, on the surface, right, this is like, I don't know what you call it. This is like the big block V8 of the spacecraft world, where you normally you have chemical rockets and, it's like how much, how many of these liquids can we push out the back end and ignite fast enough? And then you've got Orion where it's just like, yeah, we'll dump a bomb out the back and light it off. And so there is this thrill to the idea. But then when I started reading, I was like, wait a minute, they're going to have to drop hundreds of these explosive pellets just to get to orbit. And
Mhm.
then I think the fallout factor comes next, right? Okay, what happens when you light off hundreds of tiny bombs? That's not good.
I get into it in my book a little bit, and I think George Dyson does as well in his. But the way that Orion would have worked, because when I was doing my internet research, I saw a little fake patch of Project Orion where it would lift off from Jackass Flats, Nevada, and like, oh, hey, probably would have had a great view from Vegas. But when you look into it, the first bombs or the propulsive elements would go off, from the ground because Orion was originally intended as a launch vehicle. Because the hardest problem we have in space propulsion is getting off Earth, right? It would actually be very for a nuclear, explosive, very low yield, maybe a tenth or a quarter of the size of a
Yeah.
Hiroshima bomb, which in the middle of nowhere, Nevada really isn't that, big a deal, relatively speaking, and would have to get very, very high up before they would start using the larger weapons.
Okay.
So it's not quite as bad as dropping some hydrogen bombs one after another right outside your window. But yeah, I think George said that his father, Freeman, started souring on the Orion program a little bit when he saw that some research that would say for every um, Orion liftoff, it would, sicken and maybe even kill maybe a dozen people for third and, second and third order effects. Um, I'd have to see that to make sure that I believe it because you can make math do whatever you want it to do. But that is a concern because you're dropping nuclear explosives in the atmosphere, which is what the Limited Test Ban Treaty of '63, outlawed. Uh, so that is an issue. But it's an interesting one because you can make you know the other things that we do all the time tend to kill a whole lot more people, but yeah, it was one of those things that how bad would it have been? There's even been some people arguing that if we really put up Orion's like Strategic Air Command wanted in their grandest of grandest schemes, we would have run out of fissionable uranium. So there's a whole bunch of interesting ideas out there
Well,
and
let's
thoughts.
let's go into that because this was one of the grander ideas, I guess, as you've just said. So if I understand correctly, they wanted to put up something like 150 massive space stations in a ring around the Earth, right? Is that correct? I don't have notes
The
for that, but
Strategic Earth Orbital Base was a SAC qualitative operational requirement. The only space requirement that was signed by General Power himself was for an orbiting battle station. It was really impressive to look at. Uh, but really, what they were trying to do, and this was developed by two captains in Kirtland Air Force Base, New Mexico, named Donald Mixon and Fred Gorshboth. Uh, they would have a couple of dozen what I would call battleships in orbit. They were
okay.
propulsive vehicles that would have anywhere from a couple of people to a few dozen people in differing orbits from low Earth orbit to high Earth orbit in what they call the Deep Space Force. That would be essentially an orbital chrome dome where people were on station all the time, ready to retaliate against the Soviet Union in the event of nuclear war. In a certain SAC military sense, it made a lot of sense. Other people look at it and it's like that's insane. Um, it depends, but for SAC planners, at least a few of them, it seemed like the natural progression for what from what they did to what they would do in the future. And it's a great discussion to have, and it was really exciting to read how people thought through this because they were smart people that just had a lot of different, assumptions than maybe we do nowadays.
Yeah. And again, this goes back to their experiences. And for me, one of the things that seemed like it came through really clearly was, they had gone through so much tragedy and pain and terror during World War II coming out of that, right? That they wanted to make absolutely certain that this would not happen again, and if it did happen again, the United States would win. And I'm sure that the Russians probably felt the same way. They lost far more people than we did during World War II, right? So, you have both of these sides here that are carrying all of this baggage behind them and trying to rebuild and trying to, establish what was at the time a completely different world order, right? So there was absolute chaos. Now, so you'd mentioned about 24 battle stations as opposed to 150. That's a lot more practical. It's interesting to wonder where
Well,
things
it's
might
all about the budget, right?
it's interesting to wonder where things might have gone if they had attempted that, So,
It's it makes one, you know, wonder about that kind of thing. Uh, one of my articles that I wrote when I first started with this, with one of my, a friend of mine, Pete Garrettson, when we were both at Air University, was trying to explain. It's like, hey, this is if you look at anything, and this was before For All Mankind, Ron Moore's, Apple TV series, it seemed like Orion would have been the most obvious way that we could have gotten to, a Starfleet, Star Trek kind of future. Because, when I look at it, it seems like instead of just being pilots up there, they would have had a whole bunch of different people enlisted, operators, weaponeers, all these other different things. And eventually airmen would have realized, SAC airmen would have realized that, we're not flying airplanes anymore. We're basically operating, warships. And so I always thought that it might be sort of interesting how the Air Force could have evolved into, you know, uh, a space navy kind of service that, in my opinion, with my later work or my other work, would indicates to me a much more culturally correct view of how space should be looked at. And it would have been very exciting for me to, to see, the world's most dangerous and powerful military organization dedicated to, eliminating the enemy entirely if they looked at you the wrong way, might have evolved into something that a lot of people, including a lot of uh, anti-war people and certainly anti-war hawk people might consider a positive future. I just thought it would have been it's an interesting thing to think about.
yeah. Well, I have kind of a maybe this is a brain teaser. It's a brain teaser for me. There's different ways to look at it. Let me go through the final figures that I have. So, again, Little Boy and Fat Man were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th in 1945, right? That was 150 to 250,000 casualties. At the time, they viewed these as war-ending weapons, right? And my mother, I grew up with my mother saying that. That was, I think, the popular American view was it was horrifying, but it was what was required to save more lives in the long term. Um, After that, you had the first Russian nuclear bomb, the 22 kiloton Joe 1 in 1949, the first U.S. hydrogen bomb, Ivy Mike, in 1952, and Russia detonated its first H bomb, Joe 4, in 1953. So, right before the space race, we had the arms race, and they both kept testing right up until the test ban treaty that you mentioned. But so both sides are developing larger and larger bombs. The space race started on August 2nd, 1955, when the Soviet Union responded to a U.S. announcement of an intent to launch artificial satellites. The first artificial satellite was Sputnik in 57. During this period, there were also development of, again, these tactical nuclear weapons, as well as Project Rover in 1955 and 58. So the arms race really transitioned right into a space race, right? And Sputnik, I think, was the one that was really that keystone event where it was like, hey, we need to not just compete in terms of weapons, but also in terms of delivery systems. And that is the interesting question because some people have said that the space race was just a showcase for ICBMs, but historically, I think that both nations, the US and the USSR, really believed the dream, right? What are your thoughts on that?
There's there's indications that that Americans and Soviet scientists and engineers both believed the dream, and there was a lot of working together behind the scenes that were stopped a lot, but were definitely not completely ended. Um, it is difficult to see, the optimism, if there was optimism in on the military side, because the military people are supposed to stay practical, right?
Yeah.
They're not supposed to go off on, whims of fancy, but it happens on occasion. One interesting tidbit, if you don't mind me getting into a little bit of obscure Orion history.
Oh, go
Orion
for it.
came from Sputnik, because, and you can almost consider it, and I'm almost certain it was George Dyson that brought this up, that the Orion program was sort of like a who's who of people in, you know, the latter stage of the Manhattan Project. So only, like Manhattan 2. But Orion was dreamed up very, uh, like almost immediately after Sputnik, because Stan Ulam, a
Yeah.
physicist, and I can't remember his name, but I think his first name was Frank, an American, both American physicists were sitting there just disgusted um, that the Russians put up a satellite before America did. And back then, the rocket was still considered a German technology. And it's like, oh my goodness. And then they sat there in the Los Alamos lunchroom, like, well, what are Americans good at? And it's like, well, America, we're the best at nuclear technology. So that's why they developed a new type of American rocket, which would ultimately become Orion, the nuclear pulse propulsion system that was so much better than that German and Russian garbage that, we could have done a whole heck of a lot better. I just think that's sort of interesting, but that absolutely was the genesis of maybe not that that story, but Stan Ulam and some people at Los Alamos came up with nuclear pulse propulsion quite a few years before it became a program, and it was the first all-American space drive. So
And
it's interesting.
yeah, and
Um,
I can add to that a little bit. I did interviews. I knew Dr. Paul Sis years ago, right? And he was one of the pioneers of hypersonic aircraft. And one of the things that he had talked about, he told me about this several times, was when the Air Force was in charge of space, they had a program in place and there were successes and failures like anything, but they were moving forward and making progress. And he had talked about basically an equivalent of kind of almost like the Apollo program that the Air Force had planned, where they wanted to do lots and lots of rockets and start to create essentially a production line, right? And drop costs just like Starship is today. And then, as you and I have been talking about, there were things like Project Orion, as well as Rover and the Nerva engine. And I believe that was Robert Bussard working on that. And so with those also, again, Air Force heavy involvement. One of the things that Sis had told me was when NASA took over, a lot of things were changed, sometimes just for political reasons, sometimes because it was too closely aligned with military interests, right? And NASA was supposed to be a civilian organization for all mankind, as opposed to, Air Force power. And so he had indicated that a lot of the troubles that we ran into, this was just his opinion, were actually this transition from the Air Force to NASA. And things slowed down after that, right? NASA started going towards the shuttle program after Apollo. They did a bunch of things that he felt the Air Force never would have done.
that's interesting. I think that's probably has a lot to do with it. Uh, Something that I pushed in the Power book was that the Air Force changed after Power left, and it stopped being the Air Force of the bomber barons that were
Mm,
Strategic Air Command, that were, high technology nuclear weapons, and instead leadership transferred to the fighter pilots that fought in Vietnam, and that you know, uh, instead of keeping the peace and having shiny, metallic aluminum, bombers and everything that was in the 50s SAC, you had pretty much the entire Air Force inventory get, black or brown or camouflage sort of colorings right after that. And the Air Force went from forward-leaning, high technology, the art of the future, and we are going to be a part of it, to, essentially, we're not supposed to look up, we're supposed to look down. And when Air Force leadership started to embrace the we fight, the warfighter mentality, and I got a little bit political in the Air Force at the time, in the Space Force now, uh, where we're just supposed to help the warfighter. It's like, yeah, but you're totally missing commanding your medium and making that the best for your nation, you know, commanding the air, to rule the skies or to rule space. And I think we lost a lot with that. And that would strike me as being fairly parallel, or at least compatible, with what your other interviewee was saying about how the Air Force, transitioned a lot of stuff to NASA. It almost sounds like he might be blaming NASA. I don't think I would go that far. I would say that the Air Force institutionally uh, started neglecting high technology and higher, faster, farther at about 1965.
Well, it's interesting that you just mentioned the title of the book on Thomas Power. So, to rule the skies, then, again, your book on Thomas Power is really talking about complete control of the air medium through Strategic Air Command, right? And you're telling that story through the history of Thomas Power. And if what you're saying is correct, that did change after he retired, and it almost sounds like it went to more of a support role for warfighters as opposed to being ruling the skies.
Yes, I would say that. If you want to read a little bit more into it, you can definitely read my book about it. But the difference between what an Air Force does to a bomber pilot and what an Air Force does to a fighter pilot are significantly different. And most of the time, in most Air Force history, that was a good thing. In my revisionist history, that is absolutely not a good thing. Although I have a lot of good friends that are fighter pilots, I don't begrudge them anything.
Yeah. Well, ordinarily that would be a good note to close on, but you brought up two amazing points that I want to touch on. If I could go over a couple of minutes. So one of them was, um, so before retirement, there was the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, I believe. Was it 62 or 63? And
62.
62. So General Power broadcast a message taking our forces, taking SAC to DEFCON 2 in the clear. It was unencrypted, unsecured message. And this goes to what you said earlier about, um, using the swagger to scare the Soviets, right? So he said on the open mic, hey, we're going to take it to DEFCON 2. And actually, he had a pretty lengthy message there. Do you think that that had any effect? Do you think that had the intended effect?
It's interesting. When I read into that, and this has been a few years, so I might get some facts wrong, but uh, he at least defended, or other people defended, that charge that he went above and beyond his mandate by saying, "Look, this is actually what we've always done. You just have been, now y'all are just listening to it." So there did seem to be a little bit of evidence saying that this was standard SAC procedure. Uh, of course, then again, did he mean for the Soviets to maybe hear it? Oh yeah. I mean, these guys were sharp enough to know exactly what they were doing. But if you actually read the message, he was really being very calm and saying, "Hey, look, we've been trained for this.
Yeah.
If you have any problems whatsoever, you call me. Call headquarters. We'll give you all the information we need. And the best thing that you can do in this is stay calm, be professional, do your job." And really, a lot of people can argue about and complain, in my opinion, that the Cuban Missile Crisis was, we're a hair's breadth away from destroying the planet. There's an argument to be made that the Cuban Missile Crisis is exactly what Strategic Air Command was built for, and did exactly what, was supposed to happen, which is nothing, right? So there were some issues, especially some people were one. a thing that was brought up a lot was that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was an American launch out of Vandenberg, and that was like, oh, even President Kennedy, when he was told about it, said quipped something like, "There's always some poor SOB that doesn't get the message," right? Which in the military, absolutely true. But what they don't say is that the Russians launched a couple of missiles during the Cuban Missile Crisis too, but they were all very clearly test missions and no one panicked. And I think that says a lot about the professionalism of the US military and the Soviet military, and especially Strategic Air Command. But then only afterwards people say, hey, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a horrible thing that, almost doomed us all. But then again, even a couple of years later, you had Air Force generals saying that we were never farther away from nuclear war than during the Cuban Missile Crisis because SAC was doing its job. I can't tell you who's more correct, but there are good arguments for both sides.
It's interesting. It's again, these were complex people. And I think like one thing, if I was going to share something like a takeaway for the audience, for me, what I got out of my research was this was an era of incredible fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I mean, my own mother remembers doing like duck and cover drills, right? I was watching Bridge of Spies, and they talked about his son filling the bathtub with water because one of the first things to go would be running water. The entire country was right on the edge of panic. These service members, people like LeMay and Power, got us through it. They got us through it. And that itself deserves incredible recognition. So, for people who may say, well, they were warmongers, they were this, they were that, they were the other thing, they did their job. They weren't unnecessarily cruel by launching an attack on the Soviets or anything along those lines. And we're here today in a peaceful, or at least a more peaceful world because of what they did. That's amazing.
I think you're absolutely right. And of course, we should always look back and see, what lessons we can learn for the future and other things like that. And they weren't perfect people, they were
Yeah.
just people, right? But when you have people that are scared, what is the first rule of leadership? Is you have to appear unflappable and
Yes.
unconcerned to everybody. You have to have extreme confidence. And that's what they did. The problem is sometimes people might think that the uh, the role that they played were the sum total of the person, and that is never actually the case.
Well, so the other thing that you brought up earlier, you were alluding to the brown water versus blue water role of the Air Force as well as potentially the Space Force, right? The U.S. military. That's something that Pete Garrettson has lectured me on many times. And the idea there is that should the Air Force or again potentially Space Force serve in a support role, right, where it's focused on, in the case of the Air Force, maybe it's focused on bombing. In the case of the Space Force, maybe it's focused on satellites, or should it begin to look further out? And again, these Orion stations, as you mentioned, that might have been an early step along the way if it had come to fruition.
Well, that's the most interesting thing in my opinion, is that it could have been, and I can definitely see it as a theorist, that the Air Force bombing mentality, the strategic bombing mentality, which is basically from the Army, the artillery mentality of, striking the enemy in deep territory, a very much a war fighting doctrine could have provided the technology that would have allowed space to become more of if this is my favorite subject, a naval, approach
Mm.
to where you see not space or aerospace, as Power would say it, not as a solely a better way to bomb bad guys, from afar, but as a place that you could go to and you could do things with, and you can expand the human economic sphere and expand the human social sphere and spread life throughout the solar system and maybe even beyond. That is a really interesting evolution that I think could have happened in the 60s. And if it's going to happen again, we would absolutely need nuclear technology like what you were wanting us to speak about initially, like Orion or like Nerva or something else, because it's really hard to move in space and
Yeah.
requires a lot of energy. And the weird thing is, and I think it's sort of interesting, um, in order to have a spacefaring civilization, you need to be able to command world-ending uh, amounts of energy. And the first group to do that was Strategic Air Command. And I just think that's sort of an interesting idea. But because the thing is, what's, how do you destroy an entire planet? What is the most famous vehicle that we've ever ever conceived of as a human being in popular imagination that can destroy a planet? People think it's the Death Star, but that's not true. The Enterprise could blow up a planet just as easily. The thing is, it didn't and wasn't supposed to.
Well, there you go. So, Brent, on that note, let me close for today. Let me thank you so much for your time. Again, thank you for your career of service, and thank you for documenting and chronicling the history of people like General Thomas S. Power. So, I'm going to point people to the book. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to that. It is called To Rule the Skies, General Thomas S. Power and the Rise of Strategic Air Command. And again, you have covered this incredibly interesting, deceptively complex period in American history that I think needs a little bit more exploration and attention because it helps explain how things unfolded later in the century. So thank you so much. And let me close by asking what is coming up for you for the remainder of this year?
Oh, I don't know. There's a whole lot of different things going on. Uh, Yeah, I really couldn't tell you. I spent the last 2 years teaching PME, Space Force PME at Johns Hopkins. That is ending here in the next couple of months, and we'll see what the future has. I'm writing a few things for a couple of different think tanks, but beyond that, it's still pretty much open. So someday I might have to write the sequel of trying to extend Power story into trying to explain why Star Trek is actually what we're supposed to be doing in space, but we'll see. But yeah, I have no idea. The future is wide open. If you have any suggestions, I'm all ears.
Wonderful. Thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
Hey, thank you for yours. I really appreciate it.